The cold morning air bit through Oberleutnant Karl Muller's flight jacket as he stood on the makeshift airstrip near St. Lo, sipping bitter ersatz coffee that tasted more of acorns than coffee beans. July 25, 1944. The Normandy front had stabilized into a bloody stalemate, but overhead, the Luftwaffe still maintained what felt like a fragile superiority. Through the dawn mist, he watched the ground crews fueling his Focke-Wulf 190-8, its broad radial engine cowling giving it a pugnacious, bulldog-like appearance that he found comforting. Another beautiful day to hunt Americans, Karl. Hauptmann Erich von Richter's voice cut through the morning quiet, his polished boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. At 26, von Richter already had 63 confirmed kills painted below his cockpit, a mix of Russians, British, and a growing number of Americans. Muller forced a smile. If they're foolish enough to come within range. At 24, with 38 victories to his name, he was considered a veteran in a war where the average pilot's life expectancy could be measured in weeks. But something had changed in recent months. The easy confidence of 1942 and 1943 had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing tension that settled in the stomach during every mission briefing. Von Richter lit a cigarette, the smoke curling in the still morning air. I saw the intelligence reports, more of those flying tanks they call thunderbolts, heavy, slow, perfect targets. He blew a perfect smoke ring. Their pilots still think this is some kind of sporting event. They break formation at the first sign of trouble. Muller nodded, but his eyes drifted to the eastern horizon, where the first hints of sunrise painted the sky. He remembered the briefing from 3 days earlier, the maps showing American production numbers that his commander had dismissed as obvious propaganda. No nation could produce aircraft at those rates. No industrial system could maintain that quality while achieving such quantity. The numbers were simply impossible. What none of them realized was that, while German intelligence analysts debated whether the production figures were exaggerated by 50% or 100%, the reality was that American factories were outperforming even the most inflated estimates by factors no German staff officer could comprehend. The disconnect wasn't just about numbers. It was about fundamentally different understandings of what industrial warfare meant. The morning briefing confirmed Muller's fears. Operation Cobra, the intelligence officer called it, pointing to maps showing the St. Lo sector. The Americans plan a massive aerial bombardment followed by a breakthrough attempt. High Command believes this is where they'll commit their strategic reserves. Major Strauss, their Gruppenkommandeur, stood before the assembled pilots. We have 32 operational 190s. Intelligence estimates no more than 60 American fighters in the entire sector, mostly those inferior P-47s and a few P-38s. He tapped the map with his pointer. Our job is simple. Break up their bomber formations, then hunt the fighters. A murmur of approval went through the room. These were men who had cut their teeth against Spitfires over the Channel and La GG-3s over Stalingrad. The Americans, with their rigid formations and predictable tactics, were considered easier prey. But Muller noticed something the others missed. The intelligence estimates were based on reconnaissance from 5 days earlier. 5 days. In the war he'd fought in Russia, 5 days meant nothing. Fronts moved kilometers, not tens of kilometers. But this was different. What if the Americans could move entire air groups hundreds of kilometers in those 5 days? What if the production numbers weren't exaggerated after all? His wingman, young Lieutenant Hans Vogel, just 19 with only 3 missions under his belt, leaned over. They say the thunderbolts catch fire if you look at them too hard. Muller didn't respond. He was remembering something his engineering professor at the Technical University of Dresden had told him before the war. The difference between impossible and possible is often just a different way of thinking about the problem. At the time, he'd thought it was academic nonsense. Now, watching the confident faces around him, He wondered if they were all making a catastrophic error in how they thought about American industrial capability. The German underestimation of American production wasn't born from stupidity, but from a fundamentally different industrial philosophy. Where German engineering prized precision, quality, and technical sophistication, American industry had embraced standardization, interchangeability, and scale in ways that defied European understanding. Consider the Focke-Wulf 190 that Müller flew, a masterpiece of German engineering. Each aircraft required 75 hours to produce. The design incorporated numerous bespoke components, hand-fitted by skilled craftsmen. The BMW 801 radial engine contained over 2,000 individual parts, many requiring precise machining and fitting. It was arguably the finest fighter aircraft in the world in 1942, superior to anything the Allies could field. But this excellence came at a cost that German planners failed to recognize would be decisive. While German factories struggled to produce 350 Focke-Wulfs per month despite working around the clock, something extraordinary was happening across the Atlantic that no German intelligence assessment could properly quantify. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the very aircraft German pilots derided as the Jug, short for Juggernaut, for its massive size, was rolling off production lines at a rate that defied comprehension. At Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory, workers completed one Thunderbolt every 68 minutes. Not days, hours. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 3 full shifts. The numbers were so staggering they became meaningless. In the time it took German workers to produce one Focke-Wulf 190, American workers produced 16 P-47s. While German engineers refined and improved designs, American engineers refined and improved production processes. The difference was subtle but would prove decisive. Technical comparisons showed why German pilots felt so confident. On paper, the Focke-Wulf 190 Aminus 8 could outmaneuver the P-47D at most altitudes. It had a better rate of climb, superior roll rate, and was significantly lighter. German pilots knew this. They'd studied the specifications. What they hadn't studied, what they couldn't comprehend, was how American industrial might would transform aerial combat from a contest of individual aircraft quality to one of overwhelming numbers and survivability. The P-47's advantages weren't immediately apparent in dogfight performance charts. They lay in its incredible durability, its massive armament of 850 caliber machine guns, and its ability to absorb punishment that would destroy any German aircraft. Most importantly, they lay in the fact that for every P-47 lost, 3 more were already crossing the Atlantic. This industrial disparity had been building for years, but German intelligence consistently dismissed the reports as propaganda. When reconnaissance photos showed vast aircraft storage facilities in Britain, analysts assumed they were dummy aircraft or clever deceptions. The concept of having so many aircraft that you couldn't possibly fly them all was foreign to the German military mind. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, had tried to warn the high command. In memos that went largely ignored, he described facing an endless stream of American aircraft that continued day after day, regardless of losses. "We shoot them down in dozens," he wrote, "and the next day there are twice as many." The warnings were there for those willing to see them. A captured American pilot had told interrogators about training bases in the United States that graduated 2,000 new pilots every month. The intelligence officer recording the statement had noted, "Subject likely exaggerating to improve treatment." In reality, the pilot was underestimating. The actual number was closer to 35-0. Even the technical specifications German pilots studied were dangerously outdated. The P-47D models now arriving in Europe featured water injection that boosted engine power by 25%, paddle blade propellers that improved climb rate by 800 feet per minute, and additional armor that made them even more durable. These improvements happened so quickly that intelligence reports were obsolete before they reached frontline units. The American approach to aircraft design reflected a different philosophy entirely. Where German engineers sought to create the perfect killing machine, American engineers designed for survival and mass production. The P-47's massive construction wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. It could take hits that would shred lighter aircraft and still return home. Its radial engine, while less sophisticated than German inline engines, could absorb tremendous damage and keep running. Most importantly, every component was designed for rapid manufacture and replacement. A damaged P-47 could be repaired in hours where a Focke-Wulf might take days. Wrecked aircraft were cannibalized for parts that were completely interchangeable with new production. This logistical advantage multiplied the numerical superiority in ways German planners completely failed to anticipate. As Müller walked toward his aircraft, he ran his hand along the cool metal of the wing. The Focke-Wulf felt like a precision instrument, which it was, every surface smooth, every panel perfectly fitted. He'd seen what happened when these magnificent machines went up against the crude but brutally effective American aircraft. They broke, they caught fire, they fell apart, but the Americans, their aircraft kept flying even when they should have fallen from the sky. He'd seen P-47s return to base with entire sections of wing missing, with engines smoking, with hundreds of holes in their airframes. They were ugly, brutal machines, but they possessed a kind of primitive vitality that the more sophisticated German aircraft lacked. "Ready to teach the Amis another lesson?" Vogel asked, his young face eager. Müller forced another smile. "Just remember your training, stay close, watch for bombers." What he didn't say was what he'd been thinking since the briefing. The intelligence was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The Americans weren't going to send 60 aircraft. They were going to send 600. And 32 Focke-Wulfs, no matter how well flown, couldn't stop 600 of anything. The first warning came at 9:17. Radar stations along the coast reported multiple large formations forming up over the channel. The estimates were vague, at least 100 aircraft. But already Müller felt that cold certainty in his stomach. The Americans didn't do things by halves. If they were coming in force. Ground crews scrambled to finish arming and fueling the aircraft. Pilots pulled on parachutes and flight gear with practiced efficiency. There was no panic. These were veterans who had faced overwhelming odds before. But there was a new tension in the air, a sense that today would be different. Von Richter climbed onto the wing of his aircraft, then paused, looking toward the west. "Listen," he said quietly. At first Müller heard nothing. Then it came, a low, steady rumble like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound grew, becoming a continuous roar that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "Mein Gott," someone whispered. The radar reports had been wrong. Not because the operators were incompetent, but because the scale of what they were seeing exceeded their equipment's ability to measure. What appeared as multiple formations was in fact something no one had ever seen before, an aerial armada of unimaginable size. As the German pilots scrambled to their aircraft, the first wave of American fighters appeared as specks in the western sky. Not dozens, not scores, hundreds. And behind them, darkening the horizon, came the bombers, not the few dozen expected, but wave after wave of B-17s and B-24s stretching as far as the eye could see. Müller's mind raced through the numbers. 32 against. He stopped counting when he reached 200. The mathematics of aerial combat they'd all studied, the carefully calculated loss-exchange ratios, the tactical doctrines, none of it mattered against this. Von Richter's voice came over the radio, calm but with an edge Müller had never heard before. "All aircraft, emergency start. We take off in pairs, form up at 5,000 meters. Standard procedure. The same they'd used against the RAF in 1940, against the Soviets in 1941. But this wasn't 1940 or 1941. As Mueller's BMW 801 engine roared to life, he glanced at the photo of his wife and daughter tucked into his instrument panel. In that moment, he understood with chilling clarity that everything they'd been told about American production capacity was wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically, unimaginably wrong. The first P-47 swept over the airfield at 9:43, not in the tight, predictable formations German pilots expected, but in loose, aggressive pairs that fanned out to engage any aircraft trying to take off. They weren't there to escort bombers. They were there to clear the sky of German fighters before the main force arrived. Mueller watched as Vogel's aircraft began its takeoff roll. The young pilot never had a chance. 4 P-47s fell on him like hawks on a sparrow. The 850 caliber machine guns on each aircraft created a storm of lead that literally sawed the Focke-Wulf in half before it could retract its landing gear. The radio exploded with voices. "Brake left. I have 3 on my tail. Where are they all coming from?" The disciplined professionalism of minutes before evaporated into desperate, panicked shouts. Mueller pushed his throttle forward, his aircraft leaping down the runway as tracers walked across the concrete behind him. He pulled back on the stick, feeling the familiar pressure as the Focke-Wulf climbed steeply. For a moment he thought he might make it. Then he looked up. The sky above him was filled with aircraft, not just the P-47s he'd seen, but P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and more Thunderbolts than he could count. They stacked in layers from 3,000 meters to 8,000 meters, waiting for any German aircraft that managed to get airborne. Von Richter's voice cut through the chaos, calm but urgent. "Karl, break off. Don't try to form up. It's a trap." Too late. Mueller found himself surrounded by at least 6 P-47s, their distinctive razorback profiles unmistakable even at distance. He threw his aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver, feeling the airframe groan in protest. The P-47s followed effortlessly, their massive turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney RMS-2000, 800 engines giving them power reserves no German aircraft could match. He remembered the intelligence reports. P-47 inferior in maneuverability to Focke-Wulf 190. The reports were technically correct, at certain speeds and altitudes, but they failed to account for how American pilots had learned to use their aircraft's strengths. They didn't try to turn with the nimble German fighters. They used their incredible diving speed and roll rate to make slashing attacks, then used their superior high-altitude performance to climb away and repeat the process. Mueller managed to get one of the P-47s in his sights and fired a short burst from his 20 cannons. He saw hits spark along the Thunderbolt's wing root, hits that would have crippled any German aircraft. The P-47 shook slightly, then kept flying as if nothing had happened. The radio chatter told the same story all across the battlefield. German pilots were reporting hits, seeing strikes, watching tracers walk across American aircraft that simply refused to go down. The P-47's legendary durability wasn't just a myth, it was changing the fundamental mathematics of aerial combat. "Karl, I'm hit." Von Richter's voice was strained. "Engine temperature critical. I'm going down." Mueller risked a glance over his shoulder and saw his friend's aircraft trailing smoke, 3 P-47s still pursuing it relentlessly. The Americans weren't following the chivalrous one pass, then break rules the Germans expected. They hunted in packs, pressing their attacks with a grim determination that spoke of overwhelming numerical superiority. He tried to go to von Richter's aid, but found himself boxed in by 2 more P-47s. They made no attempt to engage him in a turning fight. Instead, they took turns making high-speed passes, their 850 calibers creating walls of lead that forced him into increasingly desperate maneuvers. The sound was unlike anything he'd experienced, not the sharp bark of cannon fire he was used to, but a continuous ripping noise as hundreds of armor-piercing incendiaries tore through the air around him. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 34 rounds total. They could afford to spray ammunition in long bursts, where German pilots had to conserve their limited cannon shells. Müller's aircraft shuddered as several rounds found their mark. His instrument panel shattered, spraying glass and metal fragments through the cockpit. The smell of cordite and hot oil filled his nostrils. Somehow the engine kept running, but he could feel the power fading. All units, a desperate voice cried over the radio. Break off and return to base. The sky is full of them. They're everywhere. But for many, it was already too late. Müller watched in horror as another Focke-Wulf simply disintegrated under the concentrated fire of 3 P-47s. The American tactic was brutally simple. Use numerical superiority to gang up on individual German aircraft, overwhelming them with firepower no single aircraft could evade. He managed to shake his pursuers momentarily by diving into a cloud layer, but when he emerged, the situation had somehow worsened. The bomber streams were now overhead, protected by still more fighters. The numbers were incomprehensible, not hundreds, but thousands of aircraft filled the sky from horizon to horizon. This wasn't a battle. This was systematic annihilation. The Americans hadn't just achieved air superiority. They had achieved air supremacy on a scale previously unimaginable. Every principle of aerial warfare the Germans had developed, every tactical doctrine, every assumption about numerical requirements, all of it was being rendered obsolete in the space of minutes. Müller's damaged aircraft could barely maintain altitude. With his instrument panel destroyed and engine failing, he had only one choice: try to land before he joined the growing number of burning wrecks littering the French countryside below. As he turned eastward, hoping to find a friendly airfield, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Another wave of American aircraft was approaching, not the expected reinforcements, but what appeared to be the entire 8th Air Force, stretching across the sky in a formation so vast it defied comprehension. The radio, what was left of it, crackled with the last transmission he would hear from von Richter. "Karl, they're not just winning, they're." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the steady hiss of static. Müller looked at the photo of his family, then back at the endless stream of American aircraft now filling his windscreen. In that moment, he understood the terrible truth that would change the course of the war in the West. The Americans hadn't just built better aircraft or trained better pilots. They had built a machine for producing victory itself, and it was just getting started. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the steady hiss of static. Müller looked at the photo of his family, then back at the endless stream of American aircraft now filling his windscreen. In that moment, he understood the terrible truth that would change the course of the war in the West. The Americans hadn't just built better aircraft or trained better pilots. They had built a machine for producing victory itself, and it was just getting started. The 6 P-47s closed in a coordinated pincer movement, their 50 caliber bullets stitching a deadly tapestry across the sky. Müller threw his Focke-Wulf into a spiraling dive, the G-forces pressing him hard against his seat. The engine screamed in protest, oil pressure dropping into the red. He could feel the airframe vibrating, a death rattle that traveled up through the control column and into his bones. Tracers flashed past his canopy, so close he could feel the heat through the plexiglass. One of the thunderbolts, overeager, overshot his turn, presenting a perfect deflection shot for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of opportunity that had earned him 38 victories. His thumb hovered over the cannon trigger, but he didn't fire. He had maybe 20 shells left for his 20 cannons. The American had 34 rounds. The arithmetic of this new war was brutally simple. He pushed the stick forward again, diving straight toward the patchwork of hedgerows and fields below. The P-47s followed without hesitation. At this low altitude, the Focke-Wulf should have held the advantage, its lighter weight and superior roll rate allowing it to outmaneuver the heavier American fighters. But these were not the clumsy jugs of 1943. These new D-models stuck to his tail like shadows, their paddle blade propellers biting the thick air, their water-injected engines producing a war emergency power that kept pace with his desperate maneuvers. He jinked left, then right, skimming so low over a Norman farmhouse that his propeller washed toward the thatch from the roof. The P-47 simply divided, two pulling up and over the building while the others went around the sides, maintaining their firing positions. A hammer blow struck his aircraft from behind. The sound was a deafening cacophony of tearing metal and shattering plexiglass. His head snapped back, and for a moment the world went gray at the edges. The control column went slack in his hand. He was no longer flying. He was falling in a barely controlled trajectory. A glance in his shattered rearview mirror showed the left horizontal stabilizer was gone, shredded into a jagged stump. The smell of gasoline joined the cordite and oil. He was pouring fuel from a ruptured line. "Mayday, Mayday, Black 2, he rasped into his radio, unsure if the set was still working. Control surfaces hit, going down east of St. Lo. There was no response, only the frantic, panicked voices of other pilots being systematically destroyed. "They're on me, I can't shake them. My engine's gone. Bail out. For God's sake, bail out." He chopped the throttle, trying to reduce the fire risk. The fields below rushed up to meet him. He picked a relatively flat pasture, free of the towering hedgerows, and pulled back on the stick with all his remaining strength. The Focke-Wulf mushed, its nose coming up just enough to avoid a cartwheeling impact. The landing gear, never lowered, tore away as the aircraft belly flopped into the soft earth. The world became a violent, jarring blur of noise and motion. The airframe slewed sideways, the right wing digging in and snapping off, sending the aircraft spinning in a cloud of dirt and torn grass. The cockpit canopy, already cracked, shattered completely. Silence. It took Mueller a moment to realize he was alive. The crash had been violent but survivable. He fumbled with his harness release, his hands shaking. The smell of high-octane fuel was overpowering. He had to get out. He scrambled over the side of the cockpit, falling into the tall grass, then crawled away from the wreck as fast as his bruised body would allow. He made it maybe 30 meters before a wave of nausea and pain forced him to stop, rolling onto his back to look at the sky. The sight was beyond anything he could have imagined. The aerial armada he had seen from below was now laid out above him in its full, terrifying majesty. The bombers, hundreds of them, flew in stacked combat boxes, their contrails painting white stripes across the blue summer sky. The air throbbed with the deep, resonant hum of 1,000 radial engines, a sound so immense it felt like the earth itself was vibrating. Flak bursts peppered the formations, black puffs of smoke that seemed pathetic and insignificant against the vast aerial fleet. A B-17 here or there would stagger, trailing smoke, and fall out of formation, but the gaps were instantly filled. The stream was endless, and the fighters, they swarmed around the bomber streams like angry hornets. Not just the P-47s, but the sleek, deadly P-51 Mustangs he had heard about but rarely seen. They wove through the formations, hunting any German fighter foolish enough to challenge the bombers. He saw a Focke-Wulf, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable, make a head-on pass at a bomber box. It never finished its attack. A pair of P-51s fell upon it from above, their 650 calibers firing in unison. The German fighter simply came apart, its wings folding back and then separating from the fuselage in a cloud of debris. No parachute. This was not the Luftwaffe's battle of attrition over the Reich he had heard about in briefings. This was extermination. The Americans owned the sky. He lay there in the grass, a spectator to the death of his command, his air force, and perhaps his nation's ambitions. Of the 32 Focke-Wulfs that had scrambled that morning, he doubted more than a handful were still in the fight. The radio chatter in his headset before the crash had told the story of a unit being annihilated in minutes. The sound of a Jeep engine startled him. He tried to crawl deeper into the hedgerow, But two American soldiers were upon him quickly, their Moen carbines pointed at his chest. They were young, their faces smudged with dirt but their eyes sharp. One of them, a sergeant, gestured for him to stand. Mueller slowly got to his feet, his hands raised. The sergeant patted him down, removing his Luger pistol and his officer's dagger. "Oberleutnant Karl Mueller," he said, pointing to the insignia on his flight jacket. The sergeant just nodded, not understanding the words but grasping the meaning. He gestured toward the jeep. As they drove him away from his wrecked aircraft, Mueller saw other crash sites dotting the landscape. The burning remains of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts smoked in at least a dozen fields. The scale of the defeat was written in fire across the Norman countryside. They passed a group of American soldiers gathered around a downed P-47. The massive fighter was riddled with bullet holes. One of its landing gear struts was sheared off, and oil streaked its fuselage, but it had landed relatively intact. The pilot, a young man with a leather jacket and a white scarf, was animatedly describing the dogfight to his comrades, slapping the fuselage of his durable aircraft. Mueller looked from the repairable American wreck to the scattered pieces of his own precision-engineered Focke-Wulf. The contrast was a perfect, painful metaphor. The jeep arrived at a makeshift collection point where a dozen other German pilots, some wounded, all with the stunned expression of men who had just seen their world end, were being processed. He saw Hauptmann Fischer, the commander of the 3rd Squadron, sitting on an ammunition crate, his head in his hands. Fischer had over 100 victories, a legend in the Luftwaffe. Now he looked like a lost child. "Karl," Fischer said without looking up, "you made it." "Barely," Mueller replied, sitting next to him. "Erich," Fischer shook his head slowly. "No one saw him get out. Vogel, Schmidt, Brenner, all gone. I think we lost 20 aircraft in the first 10 minutes. It wasn't a fight. It was an industrial accident." The numbers were beginning to crystallize. 20 aircraft in 10 minutes. At that rate, the entire Luftwaffe in France would be wiped out in a matter of days. And this was just one mission, one part of the front. As they were loaded onto a truck for transport to a POW cage, Mueller had one last, clear view of the sky. The bomber stream had passed, but the fighters remained, circling like vultures, daring any German aircraft to challenge them. The sound of their engines was the sound of a new kind of warfare, one where quality was irrelevant and only quantity mattered. He thought of the intelligence reports, the arrogant dismissal of American production figures. They hadn't been exaggerated. If anything, they had been understated. The reality was far worse. The truck rumbled through the battered French countryside, and the true scale of Operation Cobra began to reveal itself. The aerial bombardment had been apocalyptic. Entire fields were lunar landscapes of craters. Villages were reduced to piles of smoldering rubble. German panzer divisions, held in reserve for the counterattack, were caught in the open and obliterated. He saw the twisted, blackened hulks of Tiger and Panther tanks, their thick armor pierced not by shells, but by the sheer concussive force of 1,000-pound bombs. The road was clogged with American trucks, tanks, and troops moving forward. The breakout had begun. The stalemate was over. The defeat in the air had directly enabled a collapse on the ground. The POW cage was a field surrounded by barbed wire, already filling with thousands of German soldiers from all branches. The airmen were kept in a separate enclosure. The mood among them was one of shock and disbelief. These were the elite, the men who had dominated the skies from 1939 to 1942. They traded stories, each more horrifying than the last. They came out of the sun, dozens of them. A young lieutenant from Jagdgeschwader 2 was saying, his voice trembling. "I hit one 3 times. I saw the strikes. He just kept flying. My wingman was shot down by a P-47 that had half its tail missing," another pilot added. "How do you fight that? They have so many," a veteran Oberfeldwebel muttered, cleaning his glasses with a shaking hand. "It's like trying to stop the ocean with a sieve." Mueller listened in silence. The technical discussions he had participated in for years, about roll rates, climb performance, armament, were now meaningless. The Americans had changed the equation. The P-47 was not a better fighter than the Focke-Wulf 190 in a one-on-one duel. But the Americans ensured it was never a one-on-one duel. It was 4 against 1, or 6 against 1. And when you finally managed to damage one, it flew home, was repaired in a few hours, and returned to battle the next day. Your own damaged aircraft, if it survived at all, would be out of the war for weeks. A few days later, they were moved to a larger, more permanent camp in England. The journey itself was an education in American logistical power. They were transported in a Liberty ship, one of dozens in a massive convoy. From the deck, Mueller could see the scale of the armada supplying the invasion. Hundreds of ships, from landing craft to massive freighters, moving in a ceaseless, orderly flow across the channel. It was the same principle as the air war, applied to the sea. In England, the reality of their defeat was hammered home with brutal efficiency. They were interrogated by sharp, intelligent American intelligence officers who spoke fluent German and knew more about the Luftwaffe's order of battle than some of their own staff officers. Oberleutnant Mueller, the American captain said, spreading a map on the table. Your unit, Jagdschwader 26, was effectively destroyed on July 25th. We estimate you lost 27 aircraft. We lost 8 P-47s to all causes in that engagement. Do you understand what that means? Mueller said nothing. The loss ratio was worse than he had imagined, over 3 to 1, and that was just aircraft. The loss of experienced pilots was an even greater catastrophe. The war is over for you, Oberleutnant, the captain said, not unkindly. But you should understand why. It's not about courage or skill. Your pilots had both in abundance. It's about this. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed an endless line of P-47s rolling off an assembly line. That's the Republic plant in Evansville, Indiana. It's one of 3 factories building the Thunderbolt. They built over 500 last month alone. How many Focke-Wulfs did your people build? Mueller knew the answer. Maybe 300 if they were lucky. And that was for the entire Luftwaffe, across all fronts. The numbers were so lopsided they were comical. He thought of the proud, hand-fitted craftsmanship of his 190. It was a masterpiece being overwhelmed by a flood of reliable, repairable, good-enough tools. Life in the POW camp settled into a dull routine, but the revelations kept coming. New prisoners arrived daily, bringing news from the collapsing front. The stories were always the same: overwhelming American air power, the inability to move by day, the constant attrition. Mueller shared a bunk with a Panzer officer, Hauptmann Weber, who had been captured during the Cobra breakout. "We never even saw the aircraft that killed us," Weber said, his eyes hollow. "We were in a Panther, part of the Panzer Lehr division. We were supposed to be the best. The Jabos came in waves. First, the rockets from the Typhoons, then the bombs from the mediums, then the fighters with their machine guns, shooting at anything that moved. They turned the roads into shooting galleries. My company had 18 tanks when we started the counterattack. After 6 hours, we had 3. We didn't even engage a single American tank. It was all from the air." Mueller nodded. He understood now. The defeat of the Luftwaffe had not just been a defeat in the air. It had unlocked the destruction of the entire German war machine in the West. Without air cover, the vaunted panzers were just slow-moving targets. As the weeks turned into months, the camp's population swelled. The diversity of prisoners was a testament to the widening collapse. There were U-boat crewmen, their boats pinned down in port, or hunted to extinction in the Atlantic by aircraft from escort carriers. There were Afrika Korps veterans who had been shipped to Normandy for a last stand. And there were always more Luftwaffe personnel, their stories a repetitive litany of catastrophic loss ratios and impossible odds. One day, a new arrival caused a stir. It was Generalmajor Otto von Hardenberg, the former chief of staff for Luftflotte 3 in France. He was a broken man, his arrogance replaced by a weary resignation. In the officers' mess, he held a sort of impromptu court, answering questions from the younger officers. "It was the numbers, gentlemen," von Hardenberg said, sipping his bitter camp coffee. "We knew they had many aircraft, but we could not conceptualize what many truly meant. Our intelligence was not wrong in the details. It was wrong in the fundamental premise. We thought we were fighting an air force. We were fighting a national economy that had been converted into a single, vast weapons factory." He went on to describe the desperate measures taken in the final months. "We tried everything. The Focke-Wulf 190D with the Jumo engine, the Ta-152. Brilliant aircraft, every one. But we could only build a handful. The Americans would simply change the production line. One month, the P-47s have a new propeller. The next month, a new engine. The improvements came so fast our intelligence couldn't keep up. A pilot would brief us on the performance of a P-47 D-15, and by the time his report was analyzed, the Americans were flying the D-25 with a completely different performance envelope." Mueller thought of his engineering professor again. A different way of thinking about the problem. The Americans had thought about the problem of aerial warfare not as a contest between knights, but as a logistical exercise. How do you put the maximum amount of durable, lethal aircraft over a target area for the maximum amount of time? The answer was not to build the best aircraft, but to build a lot of very good aircraft, and the infrastructure to support them, at a rate the enemy could not comprehend. In early September, the prisoners were put to work unloading supplies at a nearby dock. It was here that Mueller witnessed the final, crushing demonstration of American industrial power. A Liberty ship docked, and they were set to work unloading its cargo. The holds were packed with crates, but one large crate had been damaged in transit, its side split open. Inside, gleaming under the English sun, was a brand new Pratt & Whitney R-minus 2000, 800 engine, the heart of the P-47. It was wrapped in protective cosmoline and crated with meticulous care. An American sergeant supervising the work saw Mueller staring at it. "Something interesting, Kraut." It looks new," Mueller said in halting English. "Fresh from the factory in Connecticut," the sergeant said proudly. "We got 40 more just like it in this ship. Another ship will be in tomorrow with 40 more, and the day after that. You get the picture." Mueller did get the picture. This single ship was carrying more replacement engines than the entire Luftwaffe could hope to produce for its fighter force in a month. And this was just one ship, carrying one type of part to one part of the front. The totality of the effort was staggering. He remembered the 75 hours it took to build his Focke-Wulf. This engine, arguably more powerful and certainly more reliable, was being produced in a fraction of the time, by workers who had probably never seen an airplane fly. That night, back in the camp, he sat with Hauptmann Weber. The news from the front was that the Americans had crossed the German border. "It's over, isn't it?" Weber said quietly. Mueller nodded. "It was over on July 25th. We just didn't know it yet." The final, formal surrender came in May 1945. The news was met with a strange, hollow silence in the camp. There was no anger, no tears, just a vast, weary relief. The industrial storm that had overwhelmed them had finally passed. In the weeks that followed, as arrangements were made for their repatriation, Mueller had a chance to speak with a British RAF wing commander who was part of the Allied liaison team. They walked the perimeter of the camp, talking about aircraft as pilots always do. "Your Focke-Wulf was a brilliant piece of kit," the wing commander said. "Frankly, it scared the hell out of us when it first appeared. We thought you'd finally outclass the Spitfire." "It wasn't enough," Mueller replied. "No, it wasn't. Because while your chaps were building a better aeroplane, my American cousins were building a better air force. There's a difference. They solved the problem of scale. The P-47 was the right tool for the job they needed doing, establishing absolute air superiority over the battlefield. It was tough, It carried a hell of a punch, and they could build them by the thousand. In the end, that was all that mattered. Before he was shipped back to a devastated Germany, Müller was shown a final set of statistics, the official Allied report on the air war in Europe. The numbers were, as he had come to expect, astronomical. The United States had produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. In the European theater, 1,234 P-47s were lost in aerial combat. Those 1,234 aircraft were credited with destroying 4861 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. A further 3916 enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The loss ratio was nearly 4-1 in the Thunderbolt's favor. But the numbers that stayed with him, the numbers that truly defined the war, were these. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,318 aircraft of all types. German factories, under constant bombardment, managed 39,807. The gap was not just large, it was unbridgeable. The Luftwaffe had started the war with a qualitative advantage and a tactical doctrine that dominated the skies. They had been defeated by a system that could replace a lost aircraft in days and a lost pilot in weeks, a system that viewed attrition not as a danger, but as a manageable variable in a much larger equation. Karl Müller returned to Dresden in the winter of 1946. The city where he had studied engineering was a wasteland of rubble, a victim of the very aerial supremacy his side had lost. He found work eventually, helping to clear debris. One day, his crew uncovered the burned-out shell of a library. Amid the ashes and ruined books, he found a single, partially burned volume. It was a treatise on industrial production methods, published in America in the 1920s. He brushed the soot from the cover and sat on a pile of broken bricks to read it. The opening chapter discussed the concept of interchangeable parts and assembly line production, ideas that had seemed dry and academic to him before the war. Now, they read like a blueprint for victory. He looked up from the book, his gaze sweeping across the utter destruction of his hometown, and finally understood the full, terrible meaning of the lesson he had learned in the skies over Normandy. They had not been fighting men or machines. They had been fighting an idea about how to build things, and how to build them in such overwhelming numbers that no amount of courage, skill, or technical brilliance could ever hope to withstand them. The Americans hadn't just won the war, they had redefined it. And in the silent, sober clarity of the peace, Karl Müller knew that the world would never be the same.